Something enormous just happened, and most Americans are only getting a sliver of the real story. While the headlines were busy applauding a ceasefire and patting Pakistan on the back for its mediation, quietly, invisibly, the country that actually moved the needle on this entire U.S. Iran war was China. Not through missiles, not through threats, not through dramatic press conferences, but through something far more powerful than any of that, through leverage, through oil, economics, and the kind of back-channel diplomacy that doesn't make the front page but reshapes the entire world you live in. As Donald Trump neared his self-imposed deadline to extinguish Iran's entire civilization, it became apparent one country had enough clout to convince Tehran to de-escalate. America's biggest rival, China. Think about what that sentence really means. Sit with it for a second. The most powerful military on earth, the United States of America, was pressing against a deadline it set itself. And the one country that could defuse the situation wasn't a NATO ally, wasn't Europe, wasn't the United Nations, it was Beijing. Iranian officials reportedly credited a last-minute push by China with securing their acceptance of the ceasefire, a claim soon after validated by Trump himself. And yet, the deeper game being played here, who gains what, who loses what, and what this ceasefire actually signals about the shifting architecture of global power, that story is almost nowhere to be found in mainstream American media. So let's get into it right now, because this matters more than most people realize. Let's start from the very beginning of this, because context is everything, and you cannot understand where we are today without understanding how we got here. On February 28, 2026, Israel and the United States launched airstrikes against Iran, killing its supreme leader and many other officials, destroying a large number of military and government targets, and killing civilians. Iran responded in kind, missile and drone strikes, and then the move that sent shockwaves through the entire global economy, closing the Strait of Hormuz. Now, if that name doesn't immediately ring bells for you, let me put it in terms that are undeniable. The Strait of Hormuz handles about 1/5 of global oil supply, connecting the Persian Gulf on the coast of Saudi Arabia with the rest of the world. 1/5 of global oil supply, gone, blocked, just like that. The impact on energy markets was immediate and severe, and the ripple effects started moving through every economy on the planet, including, critically, China's. Now here's where the story gets genuinely fascinating, and this is the part that requires you to put on a different lens and stop seeing geopolitics through the simplistic framework of good guys and bad guys. China's involvement in this entire situation isn't ideological. It isn't about friendship with Iran. It isn't about opposing America out of some abstract principle. It is, at its core, about the most powerful motivator in international relations, raw, undeniable economic self-interest. As the main importer of Iranian oil, China is the country that stands to be the most impacted by U.S. moves impacting its flow. China buys the bulk of Iran's sanctioned oil. It has been doing this for years quietly through a network of shadow tankers and intermediaries. And with the Strait of Hormuz shut down and a U.S. military blockade now threatening Iranian ports, Beijing found itself in a genuinely uncomfortable position. Its energy security, the lifeblood of its massive industrial economy, was being threatened not by an enemy but by the collateral damage of a war it did not start. So what does China do? It does what China always does. It plays the long game. It picks up the phone repeatedly. Foreign Minister Wang Yi made 26 phone calls with parties including Iran, Israel, Russia, and the Gulf states. The special envoy of the Chinese government on the Middle East issue traveled to the region in a mediation effort. 26 phone calls, let that sink in. While American officials were making ultimatums and setting deadlines, Chinese diplomats were quietly working every angle, building consensus, and maneuvering themselves into the indispensable position, the position where both sides needed Beijing more than Beijing needed either of them. China's modulated approach to the war has protected its back-channel leverage enough that Trump credited Beijing with helping to get Iran to last weekend's peace talks in Pakistan, and that credit from Trump is not something to gloss over. When the President of the United States publicly acknowledges that his geopolitical rival was the one who helped bring his adversary to the table, you are witnessing a confession of power that goes far beyond a single ceasefire. Now let's talk about what China actually wants out of all of this, because this is where most analysis falls completely flat. The mainstream narrative wants to paint China as either a peace-loving neutral mediator or as a duplicitous actor playing both sides. The reality is considerably more nuanced and, frankly, more sophisticated than either of those characterizations. Beijing is concerned about the risk of a global downturn from the war, that would hurt its export-oriented economy. Net exports contributed to about one-third of China's GDP last year, despite heightened U.S. tariffs, leaving its economy exposed to disruptions in global trade. Think about that. One-third of China's entire economic output depends on exports flowing smoothly through global trade routes. When the Strait of Hormuz closes, when energy prices spike, when shipping costs go through the roof, when global supply chains seize up, China doesn't just feel it, China hemorrhages. So Beijing's push for a ceasefire wasn't charity, it was survival instinct wrapped in diplomatic language, but here is where it gets even more layered and where you really need to pay attention. While China was publicly positioning itself as a responsible global actor pushing for peace, U.S. intelligence was simultaneously picking up something very different happening in the shadows. U.S. intelligence indicates that China is preparing to deliver new air defense systems to Iran within the next few weeks, according to 3 people familiar with recent intelligence assessments. It would be a provocative move considering Beijing said it helped broker the fragile ceasefire agreement, so on one hand, China is the peacemaker, on the other hand, China is reportedly preparing to ship weapons to the very country it just helped pull back from the brink. How do you square that circle? Well, you square it by understanding that in great power competition, these things are not contradictions. They are chess moves. Beijing is trying to position itself as a continued friend to Iran, whose oil it heavily depends upon, while remaining outwardly neutral so it can maintain deniability after the war is over. That is the sophistication of Chinese strategic thinking in one sentence. Stay friendly with Iran because you need their oil. Stay neutral enough to keep talking to America because you need the trade relationship. And position yourself so that whatever happens next, you are indispensable to the outcome. And there's something else happening simultaneously that adds another entire dimension to this story. President Xi Jinping's mid-May meeting with Trump is shaping Beijing's approach to the Middle East conflict, even as the world's top crude oil importer, reliant on the Middle East for half its fuel, seeks to safeguard its energy supplies. So China is playing 3-dimensional chess here. It is managing its energy security, managing its relationship with Iran, managing its upcoming summit with Trump, and managing its global reputation as a responsible power, all at the same time, all with the same set of diplomatic moves. At the summit with Trump, China may agree to buy Boeing aircraft, a deal held back for years over regulatory concerns that could be the biggest such order in history, as well as significant agricultural purchases. In other words, the ceasefire, the diplomacy, the weapons talks, all of it is connected to a much larger negotiation happening between Washington and Beijing that goes well beyond Iran. This is not a story about a ceasefire. This is a story about the terms of global power in the 21st century being quietly renegotiated in real time. Let me now turn to something that deserves far more attention than it's getting, which is the role of the Strait of Hormuz as the actual nerve center of this entire geopolitical crisis. Because I don't think most Americans fully appreciate what it means that Iran had its hand on that particular switch, or what it means that China was the country with the most leverage to convince Tehran to let go. Oil funds approximately 45% of Iran's government budget, and the International Monetary Fund pegs the fiscal break-even at $121 to $124 per barrel. Chinese buyers pay around $60 after discount. Read that again carefully. Iran needs oil to be $120 a barrel just to balance its budget. China is paying $60. Iran is selling at a massive discount just to keep the relationship alive. That tells you everything about the power dynamic between Tehran and Beijing. Iran needs China far more than China needs Iran. And that asymmetry is precisely why Beijing could pick up the phone and, as the reporting suggests, tell Tehran in no uncertain terms, take the deal. Because if China stops buying, Iran's economy doesn't just struggle, it collapses. This is the raw, unvarnished architecture of leverage that mainstream media rarely bothers to explain, because it's complicated, and it doesn't fit into the simple hero versus villain narrative that drives clicks and ratings. But if you're trying to understand what's actually happening in the world, you need to understand this dynamic deeply. Iran will ignore American threats. Iran will pay attention when it's only paying customer calls and says, take the terms before the ceasefire expires. The Americans can threaten to erase an entire civilization. Trump can set 8 p.m. deadlines. None of that moved the needle the way a quiet call from Beijing apparently did. That is a profound statement about where real power actually lives in the current global order. Now, there's a question that I think is absolutely central to understanding the long-term implications of what we're watching unfold here, and it is this. Is China genuinely becoming a global peacemaker, Or is it simply using the language and optics of peacemaking to advance its own interests, while America's credibility as the world's stabilizing force continues to erode? After years of uneven attempts to play global peacemaker, China's role in this week's U.S. Iran ceasefire suggests that its long bid for influence finally may be starting to land. That sentence from the Washington Post is significant, not because it answers the question, but because it shows that even the establishment American press is beginning to acknowledge something that analysts who've been watching Beijing closely have been saying for years, that China's patient, persistent, quietly ambitious diplomacy is starting to pay real dividends. China welcomes any chance to present itself as a constructive, responsible power, while the Trump administration is seen as the source of the instability. And this is the most uncomfortable truth in this entire story for Americans who care about their country's standing in the world. Every time American foreign policy creates chaos, whether through military campaigns, economic pressure, or unilateral ultimatums, China is there to offer itself as the calm, rational alternative. Not because China is calm and rational by nature, but because it is strategically patient in a way that American political cycles simply do not allow. China's sense of urgency and the mode of intervention at the tactical level are shifting as the war, which the U.S. and Israel launched on February 28th, drags on. This shifting urgency is important to track. For a long time, China played an almost entirely passive role in Middle Eastern conflicts, offering statements of concern, calling for dialogue, never really putting skin in the game. What we are seeing now is something qualitatively different. China is moving from passive observer to active participant, not by sending troops or weapons openly, but by deploying the one form of power that is clean, deniable, and enormously effective: economic leverage backed by consistent diplomatic engagement. China and Pakistan issued a 5-point initiative, which embodies the international consensus for ceasefire and peace. The use of force does not bring peace. Political settlement is the right way forward. Now you can read that as boilerplate diplomatic language, and in some sense it is. But you can also read it as Beijing beginning to articulate a coherent alternative framework for international relations, one that explicitly challenges the American preference for military solutions and positions China as the champion of political dialogue. That's not a minor rhetorical move. Over time, if that message lands in enough capitals around the world, it reshapes what kind of global order we all live in. There's one more thread here that I think we need to pull on, because it points towards something that is genuinely new in the global landscape. China and Russia on Tuesday blocked a UN Security Council resolution which strongly encourages states interested in the use of commercial maritime routes in the Strait of Hormuz to coordinate efforts of a defensive nature. Only a few hours after the vote, the U.S. and Iran announced a ceasefire deal, so China blocked a UN resolution designed to facilitate a U.S.-led naval presence in the Strait of Hormuz, and within hours, the ceasefire was announced. Coincidence? Possibly. But when you are reading these events through a strategic lens rather than a news cycle lens, you start to see a pattern. China consistently works to prevent any institutional framework that would embed American military power into the Gulf region on a permanent basis. Every veto, every blocked resolution, every diplomatic initiative is designed not just to end this specific conflict, but to prevent the kind of U.S. presence in the region that would give Washington structural leverage over the energy flows that Beijing depends on. China, the world's largest importer of energy, has so far weathered the global energy shock brought on by war in the Gulf, well compared with some of its Asian neighbors. It has done so because it planned ahead, building strategic oil reserves, diversifying supply routes, and cultivating relationships with every major energy producer on Earth. China holds 1.3 billion barrels in strategic reserves, enough for 120 days. That kind of preparation doesn't happen by accident. It is the product of decades of strategic planning by a government that thinks in decades rather than election cycles. And that fundamental difference in time horizon, China planning for 2050 while American politicians plan for the next midterm, is perhaps the single most important factor explaining why Beijing has been able to maneuver so effectively through this crisis while Washington, for all its military might, found itself needing China's help to get Iran to the table. What we are witnessing with this ceasefire and with China's role in brokering it is not an isolated incident. It is a data point in a much longer trend that has been building for years, a trend where the United States remains the world's most powerful military force but is no longer the world's indispensable diplomatic force. Iran needs China more than China needs Iran. allowing Beijing to press for a ceasefire while protecting the summit with Trump. That sentence captures something essential about the new geometry of global power. China is sitting at the intersection of every major relationship that matters in this crisis. It has leverage over Iran, it has a summit scheduled with Trump, it has economic ties with the Gulf states, and it has a veto at the UN Security Council. No other country on earth occupies that particular intersection, and Beijing knows it. The question that remains to be answered, and this is the question that will define the next decade of global politics, is what China ultimately does with that position. Does it use it to build a genuinely more stable world order, one where conflicts get resolved through dialogue and economic interdependence rather than military force? Or does it use it primarily to advance its own interests while maintaining the appearance of global responsibility? The honest answer is probably both simultaneously in proportions that will shift depending on circumstances. But what is no longer in question is this: China has arrived as an indispensable player in Middle Eastern geopolitics, and the United States had to acknowledge it.